Hello, I'm Dr. Keith Lynch, and I'm going to talk right now about your intestinal system and how it relates to the rest of your health. Most of us think about our intestines as a place where food gets processed, digested, and absorbed, and it becomes nutrients for the rest of your body, and that's correct. However, there's more to it than that. An issue that we're seeing more prevalent these days is something called leaky gut syndrome, which is an increase in the permeability of the intestine. And what I'd like to do right now is explain how that can happen and how it affects the rest of your health. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on this board here an epithelial cell, or a cell from the lining of your intestine. And we're going to use this as an example of our epithelial cell, with this being your bloodstream down at the bottom, and up here, this is the intestine. This is where the food actually comes in and gets processed. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to put this right next to it, so you can see that the intestine is actually made up of several of these cells working together. Now, you have something called junctions in between here, and they're held together by proteins, and these proteins maintain the intestinal integrity of these cells and keep them nice and tight, so that nothing is getting in between these and down into your bloodstream down here, BS for bloodstream, that shouldn't be. Only small particles get broken down in the villi in between here, make it into the cell, and then can pass into your bloodstream. So if you have a food allergy, and it can cause breakdown of these junctions. If you have an infection, if you have an H. pylori infection, if you have a parasite, if you have a bacterial or a viral infection, a yeast infection or dysbiosis condition, that can all affect these junctions, creating a looseness or an increased permeability, and that can cause leaky gut syndrome. Now, there's other things that can happen here as well that affect the intestinal health. The cells themselves have a structure or a skeleton inside of them that hold them up and keep them in their proper shape. And that cytoskeleton is called actomyosin, and it holds the cell up and allows it to do its job as a barrier. Once again, food allergies and infections can break down this barrier and cause the cell to collapse. When that happens, you can have intracellular particles moving through that cell into the bloodstream and causing the immune system to mount a response. These are two different ways that leaky gut syndrome can happen, or an increased permeability to your intestines. And then another issue that happens is you can get malabsorption from sludge that builds up in here, and that can cause nutrients to not be allowed to pass through, and those people have issues with infections, because when you have yeast in your intestines, or if you have an infection in your intestines, whatever it is that's in there, if it's yeast, it's going to create this sludge, and it's actually going to live in it, and the sludge is going to protect it from your immune system actually getting rid of it. So we have testing that we do through a company called Cyrex, and what they do are they test your blood for antibodies to see whether or not these junctions are breaking down, and that'll actually show up in your blood test. So we can test intestinal permeability at the junctions. We can test to see if the cytoskeleton is breaking down in your intestines, and we can also check for this lipopolysaccharide or fatty sludge that builds up in here causing malabsorption. Not only can we test for it to know that yes, it is in fact the problem that's happening, but we can also address the cause of the problem and then recheck this 2 to 4 months down the road and actually see that it is healed. Because this is a serious problem that we're seeing more and more in our chronic conditions, where if you have an intestinal barrier that's compromised, it can lead to infections. It can also lead to inflammation in the intestine itself, which further gets transported through the blood supply up into the lungs as well as the blood-brain barrier. And when you have inflammation in those areas, it can activate genes that can create Parkinson's, it can create multiple sclerosis, and all kinds of chronic conditions which we're seeing more and more prevalent these days. So if you have a family history of a chronic condition, if you're trying to avoid having a chronic condition, or if you just feel like maybe your intestinal health isn't where it should be, the testing that we do and the treating that we do addresses the problems with the intestines, and it also gets your body so that it works properly again and is healthy.